The morning sun rose softly over the meadows of northern France, brushing the wheat fields with strokes of gold that swayed like waves under the summer wind. The small village of Saint-Rémy still slept beneath a thin blanket of mist, its chimneys breathing slow curls of smoke into the clear blue sky. Roosters called in the distance, dogs barked lazily, and the scent of bread drifted from Madame Lenoir's bakery, warm and sweet. On the edge of the village, near a shallow stream that glittered like glass, a boy of 7 chased dragonflies through the tall grass. His name was Henri, a quiet child with curious eyes and a laugh that carried farther than the church bells. He lived with his mother in a small stone house covered in ivy, a place that always smelled of soap and milk. Every morning he would wake before her, slip out barefoot, and wander through the fields to see what the world had left behind overnight. A fallen bird's feather, a shiny pebble, the trail of a snail glistening in dew. The world to him was endless, and every sunrise felt like a new beginning written just for him. The air that summer was full of peace and possibility. The men worked the fields. The women sang as they washed clothes by the river. Evenings were filled with laughter, the slow rhythm of conversation carried by candlelight and wine. To Henri, the adults' talk of armies and frontiers sounded like stories from another lifetime, distant, unreal, belonging to a place beyond the mountains. What he saw were tractors rumbling across golden fields, bicycles leaning against stone walls, and the village postman whistling as he delivered letters that always brought smiles. The only metal Henri ever held was the bell tied to his cat's collar, and the only explosions he knew were the popping of firewood in the stove. Yet there was something different in the air that year, something even a child could feel but not name. The way adults spoke in hushed voices when radios crackled, or how his mother's eyes seemed to follow the sky a little longer than before. The breeze carried whispers, not of thunder, but of change. At night, Henri would lie by the window staring at the stars, trying to count them before sleep carried him away. He dreamed of airplanes, not as weapons, but as silver birds that could lift him above the clouds where no one grew old or sad. In his dreams, the world below was small and kind, and everyone was safe. But in the real world, the wind had begun to change direction. It carried the faint metallic scent of distance, trains moving east, soldiers marching far away, voices speaking in tongues that didn't belong to his village. Still, Saint-Rémy remained untouched, wrapped in its fragile peace like a glass dome over a music box. Henri's life was a collection of small wonders: the laughter of his mother, the sound of rain on the roof, the soft hum of the world before it knew what destruction sounded like. That morning, as he crouched by the stream, dipping his fingers into the cold water, he found a stone shaped like a heart and smiled. It would be his gift for his mother. He didn't know it yet, but this was the last morning he would ever wake to a world without war. It began with a sound that didn't belong to the countryside, a deep mechanical growl rolling through the morning fog like thunder trapped inside metal. The people of Saint-Rémy froze mid-step, heads turning, toward the northern road that led to the hills. The cows stopped grazing, the birds scattered, even the river seemed to hold its breath. Henri was by the bakery when he saw it first, a column of vehicles crawling out of the mist, grey and heavy, their engines spitting smoke and dust, trucks, tanks, soldiers. Their helmets glinted in the weak sunlight, their boots striking the cobblestones in perfect rhythm. It wasn't a parade. There were no flags, no music, only the steady, hungry rumble of invasion. Henri ran to his mother's shop, his heart pounding with confusion more than fear. She pulled him inside, bolting the door just as the first truck passed. Through the window, he saw the faces of men he didn't recognize, eyes hard, uniforms foreign, rifles slung like shadows across their shoulders. The war his mother had whispered about had finally arrived, not as a story, but as an echo that shattered everything familiar. By noon, Saint-Rémy no longer belonged to its people. The square that once smelled of bread and lavender now stank of fuel and leather. Soldiers shouted orders in harsh German, their words slicing through the air like blades. They tore down the French tricolour from the church tower and replaced it with a red flag that fluttered like a wound against the sky. The villagers gathered silently, their faces pale with disbelief. Henri clung to his mother's dress, watching as soldiers marched into the schoolhouse, his schoolhouse, and nailed a sign to the door. The teacher, old Monsieur Valette, stood helpless, his books still on the desk. One soldier kicked over the globe that Henri used to spin during class, and it rolled across the floor until it stopped at the soldier's boot. The man crushed it without looking down. Henri didn't cry. He just stared, trying to understand how the world could change in a single afternoon. Outside, the cobblestones rattled under the weight of machinery. Somewhere, a dog barked, once then fell silent. That night, the village slept under occupation. The moon hung low, white and watchful, over the rooftops lined with soldiers' silhouettes. The radio stations had gone quiet, replaced by a single voice speaking orders none of the villagers could translate. Curfew began at dusk. Candles burned low behind shuttered windows. Henri lay awake beside his mother, listening to boots echo outside their door. He whispered, "Mama, will they leave tomorrow?" She didn't answer. Her silence told him everything. Through a crack in the window, he saw a German soldier sitting on the church steps, smoking a cigarette. The ember glowed like a red eye in the dark. The world had changed, not with fire and screaming, but with the quiet, suffocating certainty that the old life was gone. Henri didn't yet know what the word occupation meant, but he would learn soon enough that it was the art of stealing a sky and convincing people it still belonged to them. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of Saint-Rémy changed forever. The laughter was gone, replaced by the steady rumble of engines and the heavy silence that followed curfew. German trucks came and went, their wheels chewing the same dirt roads where Henri used to chase butterflies. Soldiers slept in the schoolhouse, ate in the church, and shouted orders in a language that sounded like thunder. To a 7-year-old, the war was not politics or maps. It was the sound of boots that never stopped walking and the taste of fear in his mother's bread when she rationed the flour. Henri spent most of his days wandering the edge of the village where the river still whispered like it always had. The river didn't care who ruled the land. It flowed as if nothing had changed, carrying secrets through the reeds and over the pebbles that sparkled in the afternoon sun. One grey morning, as clouds gathered low, Henri noticed something half buried in the mud by the water's edge. It glinted faintly like a coin or a toy left behind. He crouched, brushed away the dirt, and felt metal, cold, heavy, strange. It was round, the size of an apple, with a small ring on top. He turned it in his hands, fascinated by its shape, unaware that he was holding a grenade. The mud caked over its surface like rusted skin, hiding the danger beneath. Henri thought it was part of a soldier's gear, something shiny and forgotten, a treasure from the strange new world that had swallowed his village. He ran back home with it, cradling it like a relic, and showed it to his mother. Her face turned pale instantly. She whispered something he couldn't understand, snatched it from his hands, and rushed outside. For hours, Henri watched from the window as she spoke with neighbors, gesturing toward the riverbank, fear in every movement. Soon, a man arrived, thin, in a worn coat, eyes darting toward the hills. He wasn't a villager. Henri had seen him once before near the bakery, talking quietly with others when the Germans weren't looking. He took the object carefully, wrapped it in cloth, and left without a word. That night, Henri's mother held him tightly, whispering prayers instead of lullabies. He didn't understand why. To him, it had just been a toy that made grown-ups afraid. The next morning, Henri returned to the river. The mud still bore his small footprints from the day before. He followed them until he reached the same spot. And there, beneath the reeds, he found another shape, identical to the first, half buried, waiting. This time he didn't run home. He sat beside it, the current lapping at his toes, and stared at the object as if it could speak. It was beautiful in a strange way, symmetrical, mysterious, like something built for a purpose he could almost understand. In that moment, the world felt divided in two. The one he knew, full of bread, sunlight and games, and the one hidden beneath the mud, cold, secret, and alive with danger. Henri didn't realize it yet, but the war had chosen him in its quiet, merciless way. The boy who found the first grenade would never again see the river as just water. It had become a mirror, reflecting not the sky, but the thin line between innocence and destiny. The man who took the grenade returned 2 nights later, his boots quiet against the cobblestones and his coat soaked from rain. Henri's mother opened the door before he could knock. She didn't speak. She just stepped aside and let him in. Henri sat by the fire, pretending to play with a piece of string while listening. The man introduced himself as Julien, though Henri later learned that wasn't his real name. His voice was calm but carried the edge of someone who lived in hiding too long. He placed a small bundle on the table and unwrapped it carefully. Inside lay the grenade Henri had found, cleaned and polished, its pin still intact. "It's British," Julien said softly. "Dropped during the retreat 2 years ago. You may have saved someone's life by finding it first." Henri didn't understand what that meant, but the way the adults looked at him, half in fear, half in wonder, made his chest swell with pride. Julien smiled faintly. "You have good eyes, little one, maybe the best eyes in Saint-Rémy." The sentence hung in the air like a prophecy. The boy who found a grenade had become, without knowing it, part of something larger, a resistance that lived in whispers and candlelight. From that day, Henri's river walks were no longer idle games. Julien would meet him at the edge of the woods, carrying maps and sacks that smelled of oil and leather. Sometimes Henri delivered notes hidden in the lining of his jacket. Other times he simply kept watch for soldiers on the road. To him, it all felt like an adventure, a secret game between grown-ups and ghosts. The men spoke in codes, using names of flowers for drop points and birds for safe houses. Henri memorized them easily. The tulip blooms at dawn meant a supply train was arriving. The sparrow has flown meant someone had been captured. His heart pounded every time he heard those words, but he never told anyone, not even his mother. She pretended not to know, though her eyes betrayed the truth, fear mixed with a strange, desperate pride. Her son was doing something no one could speak of, something dangerous, something brave. At 7, Henri didn't understand war or politics. He only understood that the men who came at night trusted him, and in a world where everyone was afraid, that trust made him feel tall. One morning, Julien placed his hand on Henri's shoulder and pointed toward the woods. "There's something we need to move," he said quietly. "A crate, heavy, hidden near the stream. Can you show me where you found the first one?" Henri nodded eagerly, unaware that he was leading a man toward a cache of British explosives buried beneath the reeds. As they reached the riverbank, the sky darkened, thunder rolling in the distance. Together they dug, hands trembling, mud swallowing their fingers. When they unearthed the crate, Julien exhaled a long breath. Inside lay grenades, dozens of them, forgotten relics of a battle long over. "You've found a treasure, Henri," he whispered, "but it's a treasure that bites. He hoisted the crate onto his shoulder, rain streaming down his face. Before leaving, he turned to the boy. "You did something good today, but from now on you must never touch what shines in the dirt. Promise me." Henri nodded, but deep down, he didn't believe danger could come from something so small, so perfect. He watched Julien disappear into the trees, the crate swaying in his arms, and the boy felt something stirring inside him. Not fear, not yet, but the quiet thrill of being needed in a war he didn't understand. The days that followed blurred into a strange rhythm, whispers at night, footsteps in the dark, and the constant hum of tension that hung over the village like a fog no wind could lift. Henri still went to the river, but never alone. Sometimes Julien joined him, sometimes other men with tired faces and worn boots. They treated him with a respect he didn't understand, calling him le petit éclaireur, the little scout. To Henri, it all felt like play. When they told him to count trucks or watch the crossroads, he imagined himself as a spy from the stories he used to read by candlelight. Yet behind the game, real fear pulsed. Every sound, a snapped twig, a distant shout, could mean discovery. Still, Henri smiled through it all. He didn't see soldiers and enemies. He saw men with different faces and voices, some laughing, some silent, all carrying secrets they couldn't explain. War to him was a puzzle made of gestures, smells and colors. The smell of gasoline on a soldier's jacket, the color of the sky when planes passed overhead, the tremble in his mother's hand when she kissed his forehead goodnight. The world had become smaller and louder at once. German patrols marched daily past the bakery, their boots echoing like drums. The resistance men slipped between shadows, trading bread for bullets, hope for silence. Henri's river, his secret place, was no longer his alone. It had become a passageway for messages, a bridge between danger and survival. He watched as Julien and his comrades hid small bundles under the stones, wrapped in waxed paper that gleamed under the water. When Henri asked what they were, Julien smiled and said, "Seeds for when the war is over." The answer comforted him. He imagined those packages sprouting into flowers when peace returned. Sometimes, when the soldiers weren't looking, Henri would skip stones across the river. Each one made a hollow sound as it struck the water, like the echo of a distant heartbeat. The men warned him to be careful, but the child in him refused to vanish completely. He still found beauty in small things, a dragonfly landing on a rifle barrel, the laughter that escaped even from tired mouths. But the nights grew darker. The air itself seemed to listen. Henri began to notice how the grown-ups' eyes shifted whenever someone knocked on a door too late, or a truck stopped too long in the square. Once, he saw two German soldiers arguing in the rain, one pointing toward the woods, the other shaking his head. That night, Julien didn't come, nor the next. The silence that replaced him was heavier than any sound. Henri's mother forbade him from leaving the house after dusk, but he still watched the horizon from his window, waiting for the flicker of a lantern, the signal Julien always used. None came. On the fifth night, a single gunshot echoed through the hills, followed by nothing. Henri pressed his face to the glass and whispered his friend's name, but the river gave no answer. For the first time, he understood that the world could take people away without warning. He didn't cry. He simply sat in the dark, the child inside him still trying to believe that tomorrow would bring another sunrise, another game, another chance to pretend that courage didn't hurt. The morning after the gunshot, Saint-Rémy felt hollow, as if the air itself had been scraped clean of sound. The soldiers moved differently, sharper, faster, eyes searching every doorway. Trucks blocked the main road, and a smell of smoke drifted from the hills. Henri's mother kept him inside, whispering prayers under her breath. But by dusk, curiosity clawed stronger than fear. When she fell asleep, Henri slipped out, barefoot, the cobblestones cold beneath his feet. The path to the river was darker than ever. The moon hung low, its light silvering the mist that curled around the trees. At first, all he heard was the steady hum of crickets. Then, as he reached the bank, a sound cut. Through the stillness, a crack, a hiss, then the deep roar of fire. Across the water the sky glowed orange, the woods were burning. He saw figures running, silhouettes swallowed by smoke, and somewhere in that chaos a voice called his name. "Henri!" It was Julian, faint, desperate. Without thinking, the boy ran toward it, branches tearing at his clothes, the heat searing his skin. When he reached the clearing, the world erupted. A grenade, maybe one of the ones he had found, exploded a few meters away, throwing dirt, light, and silence into the air. When the dust settled, everything was still. Henri lay on the ground, ears ringing, his small hands trembling against the earth. Around him, the forest was a wound of smoke and splintered trees. Julian was gone. Only a torn piece of his coat clung to a branch nearby, fluttering like a ghost. The explosion had shattered more than wood. It had split the boy's world clean in two. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what he had touched, what he had helped carry, what he had believed was only a game. His chest ached with something he didn't have a name for yet. Guilt. He crawled toward the crater, still steaming, and stared at it, wide-eyed. The mud had swallowed the metal, but its echo still pulsed in his bones. He whispered softly, as if speaking to the earth itself. "I didn't mean to." The words vanished into the wind. That night he wandered home through the ashes, his small frame illuminated by distant fires. The moonlight washed his face pale, and when he finally saw his mother waiting at the door, he couldn't speak. He simply fell into her arms, and for a long time neither of them made a sound. The days that followed were painted in silence. The Germans searched the woods, dragging men from their homes, shouting questions no one could answer. Henri's mother kept the curtains drawn, her eyes red, her hands trembling when she lit the stove. The boy, no longer went to the river. He couldn't bear to see his reflection in the water, that small, familiar face that now seemed like someone else's. He had lost Julian, his innocence, and the magic of his secret world all in one night. When he tried to sleep, he still heard the explosion, not the sound, but the silence after, the breathless pause where the world seemed to forget how to move. He didn't know that the blast he had triggered by accident had destroyed a German munitions cache, hidden near the river. The soldiers thought it was sabotage. The resistance called it a miracle. The boy never knew that his mistake had saved the village from execution. All he knew was that something inside him had burned with the forest. Henri was no longer just a child who found a grenade. He was a survivor of its song. 3 days after the explosion, the rain came. It fell steady and soft, washing the ashes from the rooftops, carrying the smell of burnt wood down into the river. The German patrols had left, taking their anger with them, and for the first time in months the village stood still. Henri lay feverish in bed, his arm wrapped in bandages, his skin pale as linen. He drifted in and out of dreams, flashes of light, faces swallowed by smoke, the echo of Julian's voice calling his name. When he awoke, he wasn't in his home. The ceiling above him was white, too clean, too bright. A low hum filled the room, the sound of generators. The air smelled not of dust, but of medicine and metal. A man in olive drab leaned over him, his voice calm, foreign, gentle. "Hey there, kiddo. You're safe now." Henri didn't understand the words, but the tone soothed him like a lullaby. The man smiled, setting a tin cup of water beside the bed. On his sleeve was a red cross. He wasn't German. He was American, and the war, at least for Henri, had changed faces once again. The medic's name was Corporal Daniel Hayes, a 24-year-old from Kentucky who had seen too much of the world for his years. To him, the boy on the cot was just another casualty, small, fragile, proof that war never respected age. But something in Henri's eyes stopped him. They weren't afraid, only distant, as if he had already seen what no child should. Hayes cleaned his wounds, fed him soup, and even found him a wool blanket small enough to fit. When Henri pointed to himself and whispered, "Henri," the medic grinned. "Henri? That's a good name." The boy smiled. Faintly, two worlds, divided by language, met in that small moment of warmth amid the ruins. Over the next few days, Henri followed Hayes everywhere, sitting quietly while the soldiers repaired radios, watching as they handed chocolate to children in the streets. He didn't speak their words, but he understood kindness when he saw it. One night, as thunder rolled across the horizon, Hayes placed his helmet on Henri's head. It slid down over his eyes, too big, too heavy. But he laughed. The first true laugh since the war had taken everything. In time, Henri began to help. He fetched water, carried bandages, even held the lanterns when the medics worked through the night. To the soldiers, he became a symbol, the little boy who had survived an explosion and kept walking. They started calling him the Grenade Kid, half in jest, half in awe. But behind the nickname was something deeper, respect. The men had seen comrades die for less. Hayes often looked at him and whispered to the others, "That kid's got more guts than most of us." Henri didn't understand the words, but he saw the warmth in their faces when they said them. One evening, as the camp settled into silence, Hayes knelt beside him and said softly, "You're gonna be all right, kid. You already are." Henri nodded, his eyes reflecting the glow of the campfire. For the first time since the river, the world didn't feel like a wound. It felt like a promise, fragile, flickering, but alive. And as he drifted to sleep that night, under the watch of soldiers who had become his protectors, Henri learned a new truth. Sometimes courage doesn't wear a uniform, and sometimes salvation speaks with an accent you don't understand. By late August 1944, the fields around Saint-Rémy shimmered gold again, though the air still carried the bitter scent of smoke and iron. The American convoy had made camp near the edge of the woods, turning the ruins into a fortress of hope. Henri stayed, close to Corporal Hayes, fetching supplies, delivering letters, and watching the soldiers repair their jeeps beneath the relentless sun. To most, he was just a quiet shadow, a boy with bandaged hands and wide eyes that missed nothing. But inside that silence lived something sharp: memory. He knew the paths through the forest better than any map, every ditch, every bend in the river where soldiers once hid. And it was that knowledge that drew the attention of Captain Rourke one morning, when word arrived that a German unit had re-entered the region. "They're hiding somewhere in those hills," Rourke muttered, tracing lines on a dusty map. Hayes looked up from his medical kit. "If anyone can find them, it's the kid." Henri, sitting by the jeep, raised his head, understanding the tone if not the words. Hayes knelt beside him, pointing to the map, to the river, then to the forest. "Can you show us where the bad men hide?" Henri hesitated, then nodded. The boy who once found a grenade was about to lead an army. The next morning, the convoy moved. The engines growled softly, their lights dimmed beneath the fog. Henri rode beside Hayes, wrapped in a wool blanket, eyes fixed on the road ahead. The village faded behind them, its church bell tower broken but still standing, a monument to what had endured. As they neared the river, Henri signaled for them to stop. He climbed down, bare feet sinking into the damp earth, and pointed toward a narrow path, winding through the trees. "Là," he whispered. "There." The soldiers followed, weapons ready, boots muffled by the moss. The forest was thick, the air heavy with silence, until a distant metallic click froze everyone in place. Hayes' heart stopped. But Henri didn't flinch. He turned his head slightly, listening, the same way he once listened for dragonflies by the water. Then, with a calm born of instinct, he picked up a small stone and tossed it toward the sound. A German tripwire snapped, detonating harmlessly ahead. The soldiers ducked as the blast lit the clearing. When the smoke cleared, Captain Rourke looked at the boy in disbelief. "He just saved us," Hayes said softly. "Again." Henri didn't smile. He simply pointed deeper into the forest. "More," he whispered. They pressed on until they reached the ridge overlooking the valley. Below, camouflaged beneath the trees, sat 3 German trucks, engines cold, guards unaware of the danger creeping toward them. Henri crouched beside Hayes, whispering in broken French and gestures. "There's a path behind. The stream. Surprise." The plan formed quickly. The Americans would circle through the lower trail, using the boys' directions as their guide. When the attack came, it was swift, decisive, and silent. Within minutes, the German unit was captured, their weapons seized, their vehicles burning quietly in the rain. As the smoke cleared, Rourke placed a hand on Henri's shoulder. "You just won us. A battle, son," Hayes translated, smiling. The boy didn't answer. He was staring at the river below, watching as the smoke curled into the sky exactly where he'd once found the grenade that changed his life. That night, under a blanket of stars, the soldiers sat around the fire, passing a tin of chocolate and laughing softly. Hayes looked at Henri and said, "You've got more courage than all of us, little legend." And though Henri didn't know the word, he understood its weight. The boy, who found a grenade, had now found his purpose, not in destruction, but in guiding others through it. When dawn broke, the world was quiet again. The thunder of engines had faded, replaced by the soft rustle of wind through the blackened trees. The soldiers were gone now, moving east toward the front, leaving behind nothing but footprints, empty shells, and the faint smell of gasoline in the morning air. Henri stood alone by the river, the same river that had once mirrored his childhood, now murky, clouded by ash. His reflection was no longer that of a boy, but something older, something shaped by fire and silence. The forest that had burned still smoked faintly, its charred branches pointing skyward like hands frozen in prayer. The boy clutched a dented American canteen that Hayes had given him before leaving, his name scratched on the side. "Keep this," the medic had said, placing it gently in Henri's small hands. "A reminder that you made it." Henri had nodded without a word, watching as the jeeps rolled away, their tires carving fresh scars into the wet earth. Now the only sound was the soft creak of the river and the distant call of a crow. The village was half empty when he returned. Roofs caved in, windows shattered, doors left hanging on broken hinges. Life moved in whispers. Farmers collecting tools from the ruins, children searching for toys buried in the dust. Henri walked among them like a ghost, clutching his canteen. Close. The adults greeted him with quiet reverence. They knew what he had done. They called him Le Petit Héros, though no one dared say it loudly. To them, he was the child who had brought the Americans through the fire, the boy who had turned a grenade into salvation. But to Henri, those words felt heavy, undeserved. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a boy who had lost too much too soon. That night, he sat beside the broken church, staring at the flickering candle someone had placed near the altar. The flame bent and swayed in the draught, but it refused to die. He thought of Hayes, of Julian, of the river, of every voice the war had taken. The silence that filled the church wasn't empty. It was sacred, like the breath held between two worlds. Outside, the rain began again, soft and steady. It washed over the stones, erasing footprints, cooling the earth still warm from battle. Henri tilted his head toward the sky, letting the drops fall against his face. For the first time, the rain didn't sound like tears. It sounded like forgiveness. The village would rebuild. The fields would grow again. But the boy who once found a grenade by the river had learned a truth that would never leave him, that sometimes the loudest explosions aren't the ones that shatter walls, but the ones that break the heart. As he turned to leave, his eyes fell on something half buried in the mud, a small piece of metal, twisted and blackened by fire. He picked it up, brushed off the dirt and slipped it into his pocket. A fragment of the war, small enough to carry, heavy enough to remember. And when he walked away into the grey morning, the river whispered behind him, not with fear, but with peace. By the autumn of 1944, the war that had swallowed Henri's village had spread across the continent like a fire that refused to die. France was free again, at least that's what the soldiers said. But freedom came, dressed in ruins. The roads, leading out of Saint-Rémy, were lined with wrecked vehicles, broken helmets, and the ghosts of banners that once waved in victory. The Allies pushed eastward, driving the Germans back toward the heart of their empire, but the cost was visible in every face, every silence, every field turned into a grave. Henri watched from the edge of his rebuilt home as convoys rolled through, their flags fluttering against the wind. The Americans were leaving, their laughter, their music, their cigarettes, all fading with the sound of engines. He saw Hayes one last time, standing by the truck that would take him north. The medic knelt and handed Henri something small, a medal, dull from dust and wear. "For bravery," Hayes said, pointing to the boy's chest, then his heart. Henri didn't speak, just pressed it tightly against his shirt. The soldier smiled, saluted, and climbed aboard. As the convoy vanished beyond the hills, Henri whispered, "Au revoir." The word trembled, swallowed by the wind. The war dragged on far from Saint-Rémy, echoing through the radios that returned to life months later. Names of cities rolled like thunder through the static. Ardennes, Berlin, Dresden, each one a scar etched into history. The adults listened in silence, faces carved with disbelief. To Henri, those names meant nothing yet. All he knew was that somewhere out there, the men who had once marched through his village were losing a war they thought they could never lose. He learned that the Germans had surrendered in May of 1945, though no one in Saint-Rémy celebrated loudly. They didn't cheer. They simply exhaled, as if waking from a nightmare too long endured. The fields began to grow again. The church bells, repaired with bits of melted shrapnel, rang for the first time in years. Children played in the streets once more, their laughter fragile, uncertain, but alive. Yet even in peace, the war lingered like smoke. Men returned missing limbs. Women carried letters no one dared to read aloud. And Henri, now 8, carried his own relic, the small grenade pin that Hayes had saved from the ruins and given him on the day of liberation. "Keep this," he had said. "It's proof you fought a war without ever firing a gun." Years later, historians would tell stories about the strange little French boy who guided an American patrol through enemy lines. Some said he was a legend, others a myth. Soldiers who had fought in the region swore they saw him, a barefoot child in a tattered coat, leading men through fog as bullets hissed past. The tale spread quietly, carried in letters and campfire whispers across Europe. The legend of the grenade boy became a symbol of something greater than war, the endurance of innocence, the courage born from fear, the small defiance of a heart that refused to surrender. But for Henri, those were just words. He never saw himself as a hero. To him, courage had always been simpler. It was walking through the ruins when no one else dared, carrying light in hands that once carried fire. The world rebuilt itself slowly, brick by brick, field by field, but for one boy in one forgotten village, the war had never truly ended. It had only changed shape. From the thunder of guns to the quiet echo of memory, decades drifted by like pages carried on the wind. The village of Saint-Rémy was no longer a wound, but a scar, healed, softened, but forever marked. The cobblestones had been relaid, the church rebuilt, and children once again ran through the same fields where soldiers had fallen. Yet time, though merciful, never forgets. Henri grew into a quiet man, his hair silvering early, his hands weathered from years of work. He became a teacher, known for his calm voice and his patience, though few ever learned why his gaze sometimes lingered too long on the sound of thunder, or why he flinched when airplanes crossed too low. He married, raised 2 children, and built a life measured not in years, but in peace. Still, every morning he walked to the river, the same river that had once mirrored a boy's reflection beside a forgotten grenade. There he would stand in silence, eyes closed, listening to the current whisper through the reeds. The world had changed beyond recognition, but the water still spoke the same language. On a cold spring day in 1984, 40 years after liberation, Henri returned to Normandy for the first time since the war. The beaches were quiet now, scattered with tourists and memorial stones. Flags fluttered in the wind, not symbols of war, but of remembrance. He walked slowly among the rows of white crosses, each one bearing a name that had outlived its body. When he found the one he sought, his breath caught in his chest. Corporal Daniel Hayes, 1920–1944. The letters were clean, newly carved, as if time had refused to dull them. Henri knelt, tracing the name with trembling fingers. In his pocket, wrapped in a faded handkerchief, he carried the grenade pin Hayes had once given him. He held it up to the light, small, rusted, yet unbroken. For years he had wondered what to do with it. Now, standing before the man who had once carried him through fire, he finally knew. He placed it gently at the base of the cross. "Merci," he whispered. The word was small, but it held a lifetime. That night, as the tide came in and the waves washed over the sand, Henri sat by the water watching the horizon dissolve into mist. Around him the memorial lights flickered like ghosts of stars. He thought of Julian, of his mother, of every face that had vanished into history's smoke. The world had learned to rebuild, but not to forget. He could still hear Hayes's voice in his mind, calm, warm, steady. "You already made it, kid." The years had turned those words into a mantra, a compass for a life built in the shadow of war. Henri smiled faintly, his reflection trembling in the dark. Water. The boy who found a grenade had grown old, but the child inside him still walked barefoot through fields of gold, still listened to the song of the river, still believed that courage wasn't born from strength. It was born from kindness. And as the night wind swept across the coast, he whispered to the sea, "You can rest now. We all can." The waves answered softly, folding his voice into the rhythm of eternity. The morning light over Normandy broke through the mist like a soft confession, pale gold spilling across the endless sea of white crosses. Henri stood there motionless, the wind tugging gently at his coat, the waves whispering far below. Around him, the world was quiet, as if even the air understood that some silences should never be broken. He looked down at the spot where he had left the grenade pin beside Corporal Hayes's name. The rusted metal gleamed faintly in the dawn, catching the sun the way it once caught the firelight of war. Time had turned it into a relic not of destruction, but of survival. Proof that from the wreckage of innocence, something enduring could still be born. Henri smiled faintly. He thought of the river back in Saint-Rémy, of the dragonflies, the smoke, the laughter that somehow returned after everything burned. He realized then that history wasn't written in books or battles. It lived in the quiet courage of those who carried its weight without bitterness. The boy who once found a grenade had grown old enough to understand that war never truly ends. It simply changes hands, from those who fight it to those who remember it. As the sun climbed higher, visitors began to appear. Families tracing names on stone, children asking why so many graves looked the same. Henri watched them for a while, listening to the murmurs of different languages, the gentle sobs that rose and fell like waves. He wanted to tell them that courage was not the absence of fear, nor the triumph of strength. It was the choice to keep one's humanity intact when the world demanded otherwise. He wanted to tell them about Hayes, about Julian, about the way a small act of kindness could echo longer than any explosion. But he said nothing. Instead, he closed his eyes and breathed deeply, letting the scent of the sea fill his lungs. It was the same air he had breathed as a child by the river, before the war, before the sound of engines, before everything changed. For the first time in his life, the memory didn't ache. It simply existed, vast, eternal like the tide itself. Henri turned to leave, his steps slow but steady, the sound of gravel crunching beneath his shoes. Behind him, the sunlight glinted off the grenade pin, catching the eye of a passing child who stopped to look. The boy picked it up, turning it over in his hands, the metal warm from the sun. His mother called him, and he ran to her, still holding the small relic that once belonged to a legend. Henri glanced back one last time, a faint smile touching his lips. Perhaps that was how history truly moved forward, not through monuments or medals, but through the quiet passing of memory from one small hand to another. The camera would pull away now, rising above the cliffs, the sea stretching endless and blue beneath the sky. The voice of the narrator would fade into silence, leaving only one final line, spoken softly as the wind carried it across the waves. He was too young to fight, but old enough to teach the world what courage means.